Throughout Michigan, there are many different cultural groups, one of which is the Germans. In this presentation, we are going to be looking at how Germans revolutionized the brewing industry in Michigan and how Prohibition affected not just brewing, but a whole culture. Germans are the largest ancestral group in Michigan, representing over 22% of the state's population. Germans began arriving in America as early as 1608, but it wasn't until the 1800s when large waves of Germans began to move to Michigan. Germans settled all over Michigan, but some notably large German communities colonized in southeastern Michigan. These cities include Ann Arbor, which was settled in the 1820s, Saginaw Valley and Detroit, which was settled in the 1840s and 50s, and Frankenmuth, which was colonized in 1845. Most of the Germans settling in Michigan came from Bavaria or were of Franconian ancestry. People of German ancestry came to Michigan for many different reasons. Many came for the affordable property and cheap houses that were available in Michigan during the mid-1800s. Germans also came to Michigan for better opportunities. Many were looking for jobs and sought out the American dream right here in our home state. Others were fleeing political and economic troubles. During the 1870s and 80s, many fled the country due to the Franco-Prussian War, which led to a large push in the German population. Religion was also a big part in why people came to Michigan. People were free to worship how they pleased, and pastors were often trying to convince Germans within Germany to move to the United States. Germans have had great impact on towns such as Saginaw, Ann Arbor, and Frankenmuth because they were the ones who built the towns. In the case of Saginaw, the Germans moved there when it was still forested. They had to clear cut trees and build homes and businesses, and were eventually able to open up practices and resume the trades they had learned in Germany. Others farmed on the land. Arguably, the largest impact the Germans have had on Michigan is in their values, customs, and traditions that we all see. One example is Christmas trees, which Germans brought to America as their own tradition. The largest influence in Michigan is through their food, which includes frankfurters or hot dogs, hamburgers, bratwurst, sauerkraut, strudel, pretzels, and of course, beer, which led to the creation of many different breweries across the state. For Germans, drinking beer is not about getting drunk. In Germany, beer is respected as a traditional national beverage. Drinking beer is used for many different social and ceremonial purposes in Germany. Some examples of this include celebrations like marriages, the end of the harvest season, sealing business deals, and festivals. Others relax at the end of the day with a lager beer stein. The tradition of drinking beer was handed down for generations and continued when the Germans settled in Michigan. Germans have traditional and annual celebrations that involve beer. One of those traditions is the Rites of Salvator Spring, which is a festival celebrated on March 19th every year. St. Francis of Paula had approved of what he called the Holy Father beer on St. Joseph's Day on March 19th in 1651, and from then on they had a religious 8-day feast with beer tasting annually, although it is seldom celebrated today. Another tradition is Hopfenmahl, or the hop picker supper. Each year in August, families would go to the countryside to help the farmers pick the hops, which helped to keep the beer fresh. In return for helping with the harvest, the farmers would feed the workers a meal of bread, soup, roast pork, potatoes, and of course, beer. Along with dinner came dancing, singing, and music played on accordions and mouth organs. Arguably the most famous German beer tradition is Oktoberfest, which is celebrated in September. This tradition started in 1810 with Max Joseph celebrating the marriage of his son. It is now Europe's largest fair. It includes parades of beer wagons, carriages decorated by brewers, and huge floats, as well as ballads, games, horse racing, food, and of course, more beer. Throughout Germany, even in the smallest towns, there were local breweries, as it was part of the German tradition. Oftentimes, children were sent to the neighborhood saloons to bring home beer in a tin pail. Beer and breweries were embedded into German culture, so it was only natural that, when they moved to Michigan, breweries came with them. At first, settlers in Michigan brewed their own beer, but eventually there was a demand for breweries throughout the state. The most notable breweries in the 1800s were found in southeastern Michigan, where the larger German settlements were. Frankenmuth had two major breweries, Geyers, which was formerly known as the Cass River Brewery, and Frankenmuth Brewing Company. Geyers was opened in 1862 and was named, at the time, the Cass River Brewery, following the tradition of naming breweries after the riverbanks they were built on. This brewery was considered to be the first commercial brewery in Frankenmuth and was family operated until 1968. Geyers was the oldest continuously operating commercial brewery in Michigan history until they ceased operation in 1988. It was eventually reopened as part of Frankenmuth Brewing Company. The Frankenmuth Brewing Company, which began brewing in 1900, was considered to be more commercially successful than Geyers. It was eventually bought by Carlings of Canada, which helped to increase brewery production to 800,000 barrels per year by 1956. The plant was one of the largest employers in the region at the time. In Saginaw, the first brewery was Shem and Grueller, founded in 1866, which was soon in competition with the Rackett Brothers Brewery, which was opened in 1867 by brothers Jacob and Peter Rackett. By 1873, there were 10 breweries in the Saginaw Valley alone. However, by 1881, only 4 remained, including Shem and Grueller, the John Rosa Brewery, Rackett Brothers Brewery, and the Saginaw Brewing Company. Peter Rackett of the Rackett Brothers opened the National Brewing Company soon after, and these 5 breweries dominated the Saginaw brewing industry until 1902 and were very impactful in the building of Saginaw. Detroit had quite a few German breweries, but none of them were as massive as Stroh's Brewery. Stroh's was opened in 1850 by Bernard Stroh and started out as a small brewery. Over time, as the German community grew in Detroit, the business had increased prosperity, making, at the time, 80 barrels of beer per day. When Stroh died at the age of 61, his sons took over the business, which continued to grow as the 1800s came to a close. Stroh's became so popular they were able to open a distribution branch in Cleveland and order a new brew house to be built. These new renovations allowed Stroh's to become Detroit's largest brewery and the 8th largest brewery in the country. Although it was one of the most successful breweries in the country, Stroh's Detroit Brewery eventually shut down after struggling for some time in 1985 and was imploded in 1986. Germans were so successful brewing in the United States and Michigan specifically because they introduced lager beer in America. In Germany, they invented the lagering process, which allowed the yeast to settle to the bottom of the barrel during brewing, creating a heavier beer that could be stored longer and better in a cask. This made the beer more palatable and sparkling as it sat in cellars. In addition, beer was easy to deliver. Beer was shipped on the Michigan Central Railroad tracks and by horses throughout the country into local taverns. Some even had beer delivered like groceries. However, despite the success seen in the 1800s and early 1900s, brewery success decreased significantly with the beginning of the Prohibition era in 1920.
The Prohibition era took place in the United States on January 17, 1920. Although the federal ban was enacted in 1920, Prohibition in Michigan started in May of 1917. This made the hit on Michigan breweries even harder, as they would lose 3 extra years of production and income. Prohibition banned the manufacture, storage, transportation, sale, and possession of alcoholic beverages, but it did not include the actual consumption of the alcohol. Near the end of the 1910s, many business industry leaders and the Anti-Saloon League pushed hard for Prohibition to take effect. Individuals such as Henry Ford were sick and tired of alcohol. Many workers were coming to work intoxicated and lost their motivation to work hard. This made many buy into the belief that alcohol was evil and that abstinence was the only solution to the social problems going on in the world. However, it was World War I that finally tipped the scale for Prohibition to be implemented. Because breweries were owned by many German Americans, many believed that every penny spent in bars and breweries was directly aiding the German war effort. In order to solve this problem, Prohibition was set into motion. Prohibition had a huge impact on breweries in Michigan. It killed the industry and made brewers have to pivot their business plans in order to stay afloat. Many breweries were forced to close their doors. Owners, alongside their employees, were left to find other jobs. Geyer's Brewery in Frankenmuth was one of the few breweries that managed to get through the Prohibition era. They began selling malt extract in order to make ends meet. Although they were able to get by, production decreased nearly 90% during these 16 years of Prohibition. The Frankenmuth Brewing Company ceased all operations for nearly 7 years after 1917. After this, it was sold to Otto Rosenbusch of Detroit, who began selling malt extract as well. He also produced non-alcoholic beverages in order to sell to the people. The Shem Brewery in Saginaw was quick to pivot to producing non-alcoholic beer. It seemed like a great idea at first, but quickly fizzled out. Because Germans drank beer for the alcohol, the sale of non-alcoholic beer became unsuccessful and the bank took over control of the brewery just a few years later. Although some of these breweries were able to maintain some production, Prohibition ultimately created widespread German unemployment. The breweries that closed made thousands lose jobs and sent them searching for a new means of income, while making them wonder how they would get through these tough times. One brewery that stood out from the rest was Stroh's. They seemed hopeless at first, as they were left with a huge brewhouse investment and a doomed market. However, Julius Stroh was determined not to lose out on income just because of Prohibition. He made a huge pivot and began selling other products that allowed production to continue. He bought new equipment and found more space in old breweries. It was here that production shifted to malt syrup, soft drinks, and even ice cream. In producing these products, Stroh's was able to maintain business and get through the low times. With the national ban on alcohol, many Germans were faced with a difficult choice. Would they let their culture get washed down the drain, or would they fight to keep it going by participating in illegal activities? Many Germans were split on this decision. Hundreds of illegal bars, known as speakeasies, began opening up across Michigan in order to provide illegal alcohol. The speakeasy allowed Germans to continue their beer tradition with minimal risk, since the actual consumption of alcohol was not illegal. However, it was slightly dangerous at the time, as they knew they could get arrested just for keeping the sale of alcohol a secret from authorities. The operation of speakeasies just goes to show you that most Germans were going to do whatever it took to keep beer in their lives. Bootleggers supplied speakeasies and oftentimes became rich doing so. Because beer was illegal, the price of it jumped nearly 700% due to the fact that many were determined to get their hands on the banned beverage. This was in favor of bootleggers and speakeasy owners, as they oftentimes turned into millionaires in just a few years. However, overnight millionaires and speakeasies would not last, as the state of Americans was at an all-time low and the Prohibition era would soon come to an end. The prevalence of speakeasies, the brutality of organized crime, and the large unemployment rate all contributed to America's wariness about the 18th Amendment. With its repeal came an end to the carefree speakeasy and the beginning of licensed bars. These were far fewer in number and were now subject to federal regulations and taxes. The passing of the 21st Amendment in 1933 made beer legal again. Germans were able to start brewing again and began consuming their favorite beverages for the first time in 16 years. German culture was brought back and was even stronger than before the Prohibition. During Prohibition, they were basically forced to abandon their culture, but in the end, they were successful in preserving the deep roots of their beer traditions. After Prohibition, many breweries took some time to resume production, as many had lost or sold their buildings and equipment. Stroh's, however, had never stopped production and was able to start back up instantly. The year Prohibition was lifted, Stroh's produced nearly 440,000 barrels of alcohol alone. In 1936, they produced 700,000 of the 3 million barrels produced by a total of 54 breweries in Michigan. The Prohibition era definitely tested the German culture. It tried to eliminate a part of Germans that felt so near and dear to their hearts. Although Prohibition worked to stray those away from the production and consumption of alcohol, German culture ultimately prevailed when the ban was lifted and the significance of their culture was preserved. The reopening of breweries and the sale of alcohol worked to preserve nearby history by reviving beer culture in the German way.
The way that we archive our history allows us to preserve it and tell stories about our nearby history. In learning more about our nearby history, we can feel more connected to our community, and we can learn from what we did in the past. We can carry on traditions and learn why we are the individuals that we are. Being Americans, most of us eat hot dogs and hamburgers, put up Christmas trees annually, and maybe even drink some beer, just as the Germans who settled here did. In learning more about the nearby history and cultures around us, we can learn to respect and value cultures that are different from our own, and maybe even take part in some new cultural activities. This can help us create a more accepting society that values everyone, no matter their culture.